the various aspects of my existence and my practice, which is photography, curating, artist activist, political activist, and as you said, archivist, have all kind of evolved from, the way my existence or my life has evolved. That's very linked to a family history because of the old family links, which travel between India and the US. Because my family has had, I had an American grandmother. So we've had links to New York City and America going back, into the teens of the last century. So, much of how my own journey has played out or evolved has been because of that family history. I realized as I was shooting, because I was, not a photojournalist, which is what many other photographers in India were at that time. I was also not a studio photographer. I didn't have a studio. I was also not doing industrial or commercial photography. And I began to realize that the photographs that I was doing were actually all around my own life. They were all pictures of people I knew, people I worked with, places I was traveling to. There were certain projects I did with architect friends up in Kashmir, in Ladakh, in the Himalayas, where I started photographing architecture, but for them. So these are parts of studies on villages, on regions, or on conservation projects for older architecture. So I began to realize that what was happening with my work was basically that. And I got a little more conscious about it. And then I thought, okay, this is what my work is going to be about. And in some ways, I realized that it would also be a document of a certain time and a certain period in our history as we evolve. And because I had access to all these varying layers of society in our situation, which was kind of unusual, it became a sort of unusual document. This book, Bioscope, was published by the Bodhi Art Gallery, which has since shut down. Both on the wall and through this book, I'm interested in making a kind of visual narrative, which is fairly open-ended, and it's up to the viewer to complete the narrative if they so desire. But each photograph is a kind of moment, a notation, in a kind of diary, which is, my own diary. And instead of writing, I make that image of that moment that I'm passing through. The book has very little text. There's a small intro text by Peter Nagy, which is just a few paragraphs, which gives an insight into, one aspect of my practice, but it's quite a concise and clear insight. And the rest of the book I sequenced in the beginning, starting a bit chronologically, where I begin with some of my 35mm work, which kind of was my entry into photography, which then changed over the years. The nature of the image making changed, and my interest changed as I evolved. The mix that you'll see here is street photography. Some of it, shows my interest in architecture. A lot of it is about urbanism. Some of it is very straight portraits, which are quite formal, done quite classically. So I'm interested, in various genres of photography. I don't limit myself in terms of just one style or one way of looking, depending on what I'm making. If I do if I'm doing a formal portrait, I'll do it as a formal portrait, which is quite obvious in the picture that you see. There's a direct relationship between the photographer and the subject. Many of the other pictures are street pictures done on the fly. So there's a real mix, and a little bit at the end you begin to see a little digital color. If I take you through it, Peter Nagy, begins by talking about two images, which is a portrait, one of my portraits of Raghubir Singh, who was a photographer who died very young, and he was kind of a photo mentor. And the other is an image of Bhupen Kakkar, the painter. And Peter talks about my interest in how the political enters the public sphere in India through signs, posters, images. It has changed because a lot of, as in many parts of the world, public signage, posters used to be done by hand. So there was this incredible visual culture on the streets in India, which was handmade, wonderful, because it had the spirit and the character of the person who made that image, or who painted that image. But one of the incredible things in India is that our public visual culture is extremely complex. The density of our population, the density of our urbanism is such that you have, so many layers happening on the street. You have people who are, struggling to make their daily living, some of whom actually live on the street or the sidewalk. You have other passers-by, you have different classes of people interacting in that same little space. But like an image like this, which is these two cutouts of the then Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, who was Prime Minister when the Babri Masjid in Ayodhya was demolished. And he was seen to have had a hand in that, even though it was demolished by a right-wing political party ostensibly against his party, which was the Congress. So, there was a feeling in the Muslim community that he had acquiesced to this demolition, that he hadn't stood up more powerfully against these people. Now, this I found in Old Delhi in the wrestling grounds. These two cutouts of him with these three Muslim boys sitting in the back. And they're obviously Muslim because of their outfits. So when somebody in India saw this picture close to the time post the demolition, they would immediately make a connection between him and the Muslim boys. And the fact that it was a flat cutout, a cipher of this Prime Minister on the ground, people would, read an image like this through their own knowledge of history. So that's something that I'm fascinated by, that how these pictures in some ways encode readings like that, which a knowledgeable spectator can understand, but hopefully they also can read the image, depending on their own proclivities. These are the two images. That's the portrait of Raghubir Singh, which was shot not far from my flat where we're filming this. And it's a kind of, it's an in-joke picture, because there he is with his camera, and on the back it says painter, artist, a little shack studio of somebody who's doing sign painting. And this, of course, is a play on the fact of him being a photographer, photographers not being regarded as artists at that time in India in 1982-83. New art, referring in a sense to photography. You can read all kinds of things. So it's a fair, it's a straight image, but it's got a little bit of punning in it. The other image across here is from Kerala in 1987, and it's a kind of found collage on the street of these movie posters and an image of Joseph Stalin on the wall. Now, Kerala is left-wing, communist. People in other parts of the world might be surprised to find a painting of Stalin because of historical readings of Stalin. The West has pilloried him as a dictator, as a horrible man, etc. But he's very regarded amongst the left in India. But that film down there is, which I didn't know at the time, was a very famous film. And it's a film about student revolt in Kerala, which was left-wing. And even my readings of the image with this, the man in the jail and how the jail bars run into the little fence that the poster has been tied on. But I'm fascinated by these, in a sense, found assemblages, found collages, which you find all over the streets in India. Political leaders, this is a painting of Ambedkar, who is the great Dalit leader, the low-caste leader, educated in Columbia as a lawyer. He was one of the main drafters of the Indian Constitution, somebody who had running battles with Gandhi on his conception of caste. All these histories are histories that I'm interested in. So when I look at something on the street, I'm in a sense bringing all those histories with me. That's a cutout, that's a flat poster kind of decaying of Indira Gandhi. And the other image here is of a rickshawala, a very poor street worker who rides a rickshaw, sleeping in the daytime on his vehicle. And in the back is the big circus cutouts, which these circuses used to travel. Many of these images I'm showing you are of those, sort of odd little moments, like this one of these workers having their little snack lunch under this movie billboard, which had this very bizarre image of a dog feeding a baby, but in multiple registers, like it's like zooming across. And I made a portrait of these people with that image, and to me it's what is this image about? I don't really know, but it's a really bizarre found image, which has a sort of delight, because it doesn't have a logic on a level. So I'm also delighted in images like that which are illogical. And that comes from my interest in, actually I discovered that I was a Dadaist before I discovered Dada. And an image of Sridevi, famous movie star, but painted on probably a cloth billboard, which is then being used as the site of a tent. So this is an image which has gone through different spaces in its own life, and somebody's poked out that eye over there. So to me, some of these are mysterious. The image of the cutout which says gents urinal, which was very funny to find, because it's a sheer chance image. The guy who put up those metal barriers on the edge of that circus compound didn't realize that he's putting up this sign right under that cutout which is behind. So this is not deliberately designed by someone. It's this wonderful chance image that I saw, and I noted it. These are some pictures from high society in Delhi. The image here on the side is of a dinner party at a friend's house, and that's a sort of junior politician from Kerala who had a one-person party, Unni Krishnan. But the man sitting on the couch in the back, who was this very foppish socialite in Delhi, is now the chief minister of Orissa state, and has been for a number of years. His father was a very senior politician, but he was not going to be a politician. He was somebody who was doing these books with Jackie Kennedy, etc. So this is a scene where somebody's reading his palm. So in a way that this is an insider scene of what Delhi is, of the kinds of interactions that an insider would have when you have an entree into that level of society where politicians, high society, artists are, hanging out with each other, they know each other, etc. And on a similar level, the other picture here, which is a costume party, again a high society costume party, where people came dressed as their favorite politicians. So what the man on the side there is Jawaharlal Nehru's nephew, but he's come as his uncle. He's come as Jawaharlal. The man in the middle is Lalit Nirula, who set up the Nirula's pizza chain, and he's dressed as Karunanidhi, the great politician from Tamil Nadu. And Bernard Imhasli, who's a Swiss journalist, has come as Ottavio Quattrocchi, the very controversial Italian businessman who got involved in the Bofors gun payoff scandal, which basically brought down the Rajiv Gandhi government. So here my fascination is the kind of play, almost theatrical play of of politics and politicians in a high society situation. So that's where, politics is entering a completely different arena. So it's from the street poster to party theatrics. My interest in history, these are two pictures from the Lothian Cemetery in Delhi, which is not very far from where I live now. It's the oldest British Christian cemetery in Delhi, and it was occupied by Dalit, low-caste Christian families who didn't have a place to live. So they built their homes in and around these graves. But also many of the graves are from the 1857 rebellion against the British, which is a great moment in Delhi's history, which was brutally crushed by the Brits. And many of them were buried in this cemetery. So, there are levels of interest for me over here, because anyone who knows the history of 1857 would immediately connect to what this was. Pictures that I was doing of the wrestlers in Old Delhi. I got very fascinated by this culture because this is kind of a people's sport which takes place in the old city, and many of these wrestlers are shop owners. They have sweet shops or milk shops, etc. And the wrestling is kind of a social sport. I was actually fascinated because I found this, the mix of the Hindus and the Muslims who participated in this was fascinating. And I learned that over time. This was not something which was overt, but I realized that there are Muslim akhadas or clubs who train, and there are Hindu akhadas or clubs who train, but on the field they wrestle together. And when the azan or the call to prayer comes from the mosque, which is the biggest mosque in India actually, the Jama Masjid built by the Mughals, everything stops and the Muslims go and do their wash up, and they go and do their prayer on the hill inside that little compound in the back. And then after the prayer is over, they come back and the whole thing starts again. So I was very fascinated by the sociology of this wrestling culture, because it was, it's a part of the culture of the old city that I live right next to. These are two pictures. One is of the artist Bhupen Kakkar, who was a very good friend. And Bhupen was a very eccentric character. He was essentially a self-taught painter. Bhupen was very unusual because he was gay, and he came from this very middle-class family. He lived with a lover who was married, who had another family, etc. And Bhupen was fascinated by the public street culture, as I was. But he was one of the first artists who delved into that kind of visual language in his own work. And since he was self-taught, it kind of jived, he loved this public culture of the streets, and his sexuality became a subject in his work. But Bhupen was very funny. He had a very wicked sense of humor. And we had done, this was a Sehmat project we were doing, which was on Gandhi. And we had a meeting at this Gandhi darshan. And of course, Bhupen couldn't resist running into that crotch. It's really not a lap, it's the crotch of Gandhi. And he just delighted in the fact that, that there he could, and he posed himself, and I shot this picture. So, and he comes from Gujarat, which is where Gandhi came from. So, this has got hopefully both my humor, Bhupen's humor, allusions to his own history. Gandhi, who was a very moralistic figure, probably would have staunchly, opposed any notion of homosexuality, etc. So, there are many readings one could see, but if you knew Bhupen, this picture really is, in a sense, what Bhupen was. There he finds this public statue and starts misbehaving inside it with great delight. This picture over here is a portrait of M.F. Hussain, who was one of our most famous artists, who was Muslim, and who ended up getting hounded out of the country by the Hindu right, by the BJP, the RSS, the Shiv Sena, accusing him of having painted offensive images of our gods and goddesses. Completely political attack. But this is a slightly, witty picture of him because he was very famous for painting horses. I mean, making paintings of horses, images of horses, but in this case he's actually painting a horse, on a horse. So I call it Hussain painting a horse, so it's a little inside joke. He was also a very public person who had a sort of performative persona in the public. And that you see that in the back with all the press and cameras, looking at this man doing this event on the side of the horse. So this is, in a sense, it's about Hussain. It's about his public position as this, important artist who does theatrical events in the public space. But it's also, ironic when you look back at what happened to Hussain, and he died in exile in London. The other picture is in New York, actually, of dear artist friends in New York City, in my friend Judy Reddy's studio. And this was actually set up. I was going to do a formal portrait, but the picture I did was of them gathering for the portrait. It's Zarina Hashmi, who's the great printmaker, works with paper, lives in New York. Tayyab Mehta, who died, and Krishna Reddy, the great printmaker, who moved to New York and taught at NYU. So these are people that I knew, they're artist friends, but all of whom are kind of legendary. And that's Judy Reddy, Krishna's wife, who does this very freaky kind of work. This is Ram Vilas Paswan, who's a Dalit, low-caste politician from Bihar, whom I had become very close to, and we no longer speak because he is now in the government with Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister, the man who we have opposed and opposed his politics for many years. So I see his joining with Modi as a very opportunistic thing. So this again is a picture, this is in his own home, his own living room. So this is an insider view of a very public person, which is quite unusual. Images of politics, I mean very direct ones in this case, as they impinge in our public space, but in a very theatrical and dramatic manner. Bioscope, by the way, was the name of this contraption that these people would go around in the villages and the streets, even in the cities. It was this little machine that they had built, which was like a little peep show. You give him a little money, and he would open that cover of the pot, which was usually like a coffee tin attached to this box. And inside they had a roll of images. So I called this work, this assemblage, a bioscope, because for me, in a way, it was that. It was looking through at these sets of images which are unspooling, almost in a childlike way, of looking at the world.